Okay, let's get going here. Let me go back a scooch. That's still there. Okay. All right. So, obviously, you know, the second midterm quickly approaches. A few of you have been in to see me already about midterm review for the first one to kind of see what happened. I've got a whole bunch more this week. I had opened up a few extra slots for appointments, and they filled up pretty quickly. So I think like my official appointment slots are full. If you're really wanting to see your exam and you haven't had a chance to, do let me know, and I will see what I can do. Okay, so the kind of plan for today, tomorrow, sorry, not today, tomorrow. You don't care about tomorrow, you're not here. Today, Wednesday, and Friday is we should be able to kind of punch through kind of sexuality and intimacy pretty quickly, finish it by the end of Wednesday's class, and then have Friday for like review or kind of wrapping up like loose threads. Okay, and so the second midterm will be on whatever we've covered since the first one, which I think is work, families, and will be sex and intimacy. So, and then we'll push religion off until after the midterm, and we'll come at it fresh after that. Okay. So, last time, right, we sort of started talking about some of the trends in terms of kind of sex and intimacy for emerging adults. And so we're going to continue with that, you know, and we're going to like watch a kind of a shortish video, I think it's about 7 minutes long, where Donna Freitas, who's, you know, done some interesting work on this, sort of lays out the case for what hookup culture looks like, and then kind of continue moving from there. Okay, so very quick introduction to who Donna is. So Donna, I think she's now sort of worked her way out of academia, as some people do. I think her last posting was in 2022, and since then she's sort of worked her way out of academia. But prior to that, you know, she had done some lives of, you know, college students in the U.S. and how it related to their sexuality and their sex lives, which I thought was a really interesting, really interesting book. She also wrote a book called The End of Sex, which came out of the same kind of research project, and from which, you know, we draw essentially today's interesting sort of tidbits about hookup culture. Okay, she did this really interesting project where she went around to 4 different college types in the US. So that she had non-religious public, non-religious private. So non-religious public would be like your state schools. Non-religious private would be, you know, places like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford University. You know, these private universities in the US that didn't have a religious basis, and then Catholic colleges, right? So you could think here of, you know, there's lots of them: Gonzaga, University of Notre Dame. There's a ton of other, like Fordham University in New York, lots of Catholic colleges, and then evangelical Christian colleges in the US as well. And kind of surveyed as many people as she could talk to about kind of their sex lives and what was going on for them, and then, you know, put this all together, like I said, into 2 books: Sex and the Soul, and then The End of Sex. Okay, so one of the big things that came out of the project was a kind of look at hookup culture, and she did this really interesting video, which unfortunately you can't find on. There's a longer version of it, but unfortunately the whoever had filmed it took it down after I downloaded it and clipped it here. So the full version, as far as I can tell, no longer exists, but she did this talk basically on what her research findings on hookup culture were. All right, I'm assuming the sound works. Let's give it a try.
That I collected from students. So
it does not work. Wait. Sorry.
Young adult
okay.
Collected from students. So young adults believe they are supposed to be casual about sex in college. And so 45% of the students that, that answer this question about what do you think your peers think about sex at college, and 36% of the students at non-religious, private, and public institutions said, my peers are too casual about sex. So they made a differentiation between everybody else and themselves. Everybody is casual about sex, but I'm not. And then just about the rest of the students said, everybody on my campus is casual about sex. So they didn't make a judgment, they just said to be at college is to be casual about sex, though many of them don't feel that way themselves. Now I'm going to tell you, so the official social contract of the hookup, it really is, it's a social contract. So one, it's anything from kissing to sex, and I mean that, anything from kissing to sex. It's a broad spectrum of sexual activity. We often assume it's casual sex or it's sexual intercourse, but it doesn't have to be. It might be, but it might not. It could be making out in the corner for 5 minutes, and the reason why is because students like a broad umbrella for what a hookup is because there's so much pressure to claim that you're a part of it. And so often hookups are a lot more innocent than they might sound because so many students, especially young men, feel like they need to be able to claim high numbers. The other thing that defines a hookup is that it's brief. Some people just assume one night stand, but it might literally just mean like 5 minutes in the bathroom. I know, very romantic, bathroom kissing. So, but definitely brief. And then the third one is the one that really trips students up. So you're not supposed to feel any emotion. You are not supposed to get attached. And so communication equals bad. So you're not supposed to communicate because if you communicate, you might actually start to care. Then the fourth unofficial one I'll add is alcohol. So many students that I talk to will say things like, without alcohol, nobody would ever get together. Without alcohol, nobody would ever kiss. So, what do college students say about their hookups? So the students who talked about their hookups from my study broke up in the following way. 41% of them talked about their hookups as making them profoundly unhappy. So they used words like, hookups make me feel unhappy, abused, sad, disgusted, duped. So a lot of sadness. And then there's these 23% who are ambivalent, and 36% who are more or less fine. And I put them almost together because there's really a fine line between the students who say they're ambivalent and the students who are just fine. And so the students who are ambivalent use the word whatever all the time, which is why I like to call them the whateverists. So they would say things like, hooking up is whatever, it's whatever, it's whatever. And so therefore they're the whateverists. And then you have this other group, they're the happiest bunch in the hookup crowd, I think, and they say that their hookups are fine. And that's it, they're fine. Not fantastic, not fabulous, but fine. And I think we often assume that a hookup is going to be this very exciting, wonderful, freeing experience of sexual intimacy where you're at a party and you see someone you think is hot and you tell your friends, look at the hot person, and then you go and you conquer the hot person and you're like, wow. And it's more like the way the students describe, you're drunk, you're at a party, you're sitting on the couch, it's 3 a.m, you're looking around, you don't know where your roommates went, you're tired, you don't know how you're getting home. You look next to you, there's this person, they look at you, you're like, all right. And so those are the fine, ambivalent sorts of hookups, not so exciting. Which brings me to, hookups are efficient. Now let me explain that. That's not my language, that's the student's language. I remember the first time I heard that, I started hearing it a couple of years ago when a student told me, well, hookups are efficient. I remember thinking, efficient? You mean like a vacuum cleaner? So, and so I think, so that the students are getting, that group, that whatever's group in the middle, they're getting bigger. Students are getting more ambivalent about sex. They're getting better at the hookup contract, right? Because to not care is to be ambivalent, to be whatever about it. So hookups are efficient, and when you ask students what they mean by that, they will say, well, we're really busy. We're also overscheduled. We have such long to-do lists. We have so much to get done. Everything is go, go, go. We're always on, and everyone expects that of us. We have no time for relationships in college. We have been told by the forces that are, but we gotta get our sex done, kind of like you gotta get the dishes done. That's how they talk about it. And so hookups are efficient. So it's efficient sexual intimacy. So students on college campuses today, if you talk to them, they will often tell you that they believe hookups are their only option. And there's a lot of suffering in hookup culture. There's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of alienation. And the ambivalence that I see growing on college campuses around sex, I think, is a form of suffering. So I want to mention romance and dating, because in the middle of all this hookup culture and this hooking up and talking about how sad they are, or how ambivalent they are, or how efficient hookups are, if you ask students today about dating, they get all excited. And so I asked every single student for my study, so what's dating like here? You know, do people date in college? And I got the same answer over and over again, which was something like the following. Nobody ever dates here. People don't date any college anymore, and we're not allowed to date. But then they would finish, but I wish they would. I would totally go on a date if someone asked me, or like I would ask somebody out if it wouldn't be weird. And so I heard this so often, over and over again, this, there is no dating, but I wish there would be, that I got to the point where at the end of my interviews, I wanted to tell the students, listen, I know you think that nobody ever dates here. However, when you leave this room, someone's gonna be waiting to come talk to me. If you think they're cute, you should totally ask them out, because believe me, they wanna date you. If they're not your type, just come back, I'm here all week. So, lots and lots of interest in dating, but lots of unfulfilled dating going on. So students want to date, they feel like they're not allowed to. And the other thing, and this is both men and women, by the way, everyone assumes women want to date, men don't, but both men and women want to date, and men will tell you this behind closed doors. The other thing they yearn for is romance, so much yearning for romance. And what I learned from students was, ironically, in the middle of hookup culture, romance is very chaste. Romance is talking, it's just talking. It is talking for hours, like 5 hours. So, and not just anywhere, not like in the hall of your residence hall. So it's talking for 5 hours in a really lovely place. Like ideally there's a picnic blanket, ideally there's stars, or perhaps 100 candles lit in the room. As a former res life person, I remember thinking, but you're not in your residence hall room because you might burn the hall down. And so lots and lots of yearning for romance. And if you remember, I said that one of the things that defines a hookup is no communication, right? No connection. Well, romance to students is connection. It is knowing and being known. It's having a lavish amount of time to do that. It is just talking. Now, here comes the quiz.
You don't have to do the quiz. Okay, so lots in there, obviously. I wrote this down. Because the word she uses is chaste, which is maybe a little bit of a word you don't hear that much, right? And if it's the root word from which we get, chastity. So, right, love that's chaste is love that's very kind of pure and is essentially in a lot of ways non-sexual, right? It's not looking for that, at least initially. Okay, so again, you just watched the video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to have a slide to sort of, this picture makes me laugh every time. I don't know why. You have a new match on Tinder. Ooh, looks fun. Okay, so this is the official social contract of the hookup, right? So this social contract, right, it's not like it's written down. It's just something that everybody seems to understand, right? According to Freitas, right? Everybody kind of knows what hookups are, and this is the rules for it. So again, just to reiterate, it is really broad in terms of its construction, right? So anything from kissing to sex can be a hookup. And as she says, right, this is to increase the numbers. And this seems to be especially important for young men, right? Young men are, still gain quite a bit of social status from, what you would call an increased body count, right? Or an increased number of hookups. Now that is shifting as well. It used to be that there was a much stronger negative directed towards women that had, more hookups. That has shifted a little bit, even since Freitas kind of wrote her book, The End of Sex, which I think is about 12 years old now. So, it's getting a little dated, but still. So really was in the service of, males more so than females, right? Or more so than women, because for men, having a higher number of partners or higher number of hookups was a social benefit for women. It has tended historically to be a bit of a detriment. Brief, right? And here I have in brackets efficient, right? And she says like a vacuum cleaner. And here I want to make a connection to some of the other stuff that we've been talking about, because I think there is a connection here as well to some of the stuff we talked about in terms of things like the capstone model of marriage, right? So why does sex have to be efficient? I'm not sure my green's going to show up on that yellow background, so I'm going to surreptitiously change it to something else. I guess we'll go back to red. So why does it have to be efficient? Well, relationships, especially the serious ones, when do those happen for young adults? Well, they happen later, right? This is going to be, after education, after travel, after career, right? So you don't really want to get into a serious relationship while you're here, right? While you're doing the education, because that is going to scramble that timeline, right? You're not supposed to get into a serious relationship. Those are time consuming. They're difficult. They're going to get in the way of the travel and the establishing career maybe, right? And it's not part of the life script, right, that people have adopted, which is, marriage is that capstone, right? So that final relationship goal is something you do. That's a capstone. My little triangular capstone. It's something that you do at the end, right? Not at the beginning of your adult life. And again, the inversion here from the silence is notable, right? For, if you had said something like this to the silence, it would have made no sense, right? Because efficiency was not something that you needed to have in relationships. In fact, I think the expectation was that it was going to be kind of, not particularly efficient, but it was there for other reasons. Okay, so everything in the service of kind of that career and that efficiency is, I think, what we're getting here with, with the later end of millennials and kind of through a lot of Gen Z. Okay, obviously hookups, right? You're supposed to have no emotions, right? You're not supposed to get attached. And with that comes, you're not supposed to communicate, right? Because you're not supposed to have feelings. It's just supposed to be this passing thing, right? And in fact, catching feelings for someone you hooked up with is likely to get you, kind of dropped, or ghosted, if you will. And then alcohol, right? Think of alcohol here as what you would call a social lubricant, right? In the sense that, alcohol, and you can include marijuana in this as well, it's really probably quite uncomfortable to just hook up with random strangers, right? Whether it's making out with them or, one night stand, whatever, wherever it goes, it's uncomfortable, right? To kind of get through those inhibitions, some kind of social lubricant is required. So this is something, when she says, everybody says around here, no one would ever get together if it wasn't for alcohol, that suggests something about, I think, hookup culture in general, that at its core, and at least at the beginning, when people are getting used to it, right, when they're entering kind of emerging adulthood and sort of becoming hookup culture practitioners, at first it's an uncomfortable experience, right, because, people are a little gross sometimes, and the thought of kissing a stranger or getting intimate with a stranger is difficult, so you handle that difficulty with alcohol, right? Okay, pretty straightforward, I think. And again, she kind of classes people in three categories. And here are the statistics. If you didn't get a chance to write it down, 41%, 2/5 are unhappy, profoundly unhappy. 20, a quarter-ish are, whatever. And 36% are more or less fine. Again, she says not great, but fine. Okay. Just wondering if, no, Chris. Yes, that is correct. Perfectly phrased. Okay, so her conclusion, right? So her conclusion largely is that most students actually still want a relationship. But for a number of cultural reasons, the culture has prioritized away from relationships for emerging adults, right? For emerging adults, you don't go towards relationships, at least not serious ones, for the most part. So a large number of them, that leaves them, if they want to, there's this kind of dual belief, right? That when you're young, right, when you're in your 20s especially, that's the time for you to be sexually active, to sexually experiment, right, to do all of these things. But it's a culture that says relationships are for later, serious ones. So the alternative is this sort of efficient, low emotion relationship that we call the hookup. So again, there's a kind of friction here, right? There's a sort of cultural friction. This is a little bit difficult for people because what they want still, for the most part, is relationships, but that young adult culture has kind of prioritized away from relationships. So, to the point, and I would say this, that, the social script that used to be involved with dating has kind of largely withered away to the point that people no longer, as she says, no one knows how to do it. There's a really interesting, it's a documentary, and if we had more time, and I know I could make more time if I wanted to, but I don't love showing whole documentaries in class. It's really easy for me, but less impactful. There's this documentary kind of from around the same time called The Dating Project, right? And it was Carrie Cronin, a professor Carrie Cronin, who was a professor at Boston University. And she was doing this class basically with senior undergraduates, mostly women, though a few men joined as well. And they were talking, basically about dating and sexual relationships. I can't remember the title of the class. I have to rewatch the documentary. And, her students went off for spring break. A lot of them, went to these resorts in places like Florida or Cabo, and hooked up with other people and came back, and they sort of talked about this experience. Can you imagine how uncomfortable that would be, with you and your peers and your professor, middle-aged woman, Carrie Cronin, you're being like, so how many hookups did you have during your spring break? What was it like? Yeah, you can imagine how fun this class would have been. But one of the things is like, a lot of the young women especially came back and they were like, actually this kind of, I hooked up, but it was kind of gross, it kind of sucked. And so they started thinking about like why people hooked up, right? And it was sort of this same conclusion that Donna Freitas comes to. It's like, that's the script. And it's like, okay, well, you'd like to bring back dating culture, but no one knows how. So they actually like researched dating culture from back, the 50s through the 90s. And then they created an assignment. It was the final assignment for the course for all of those who didn't have a romantic partner. And it was to ask someone out on a date, because sometimes academics do really weird things. And that one was a really weird one. It was kind of funny. And there's all sorts of rules, right? I love the rules behind the Carrie Cronin dating assignment. It was something like, it has to be in public, can't last more than 90 minutes. There can't be any alcohol involved. You had to prepare 10 discussion questions to have with the person that you asked out on a date. Asking the person, so it's just like topics that you could talk about. You had to ask, basically from the date that the assignment was given, you had to ask someone out within a week, and you had to do it in person. So you had to kind of figure out how to go up to the cute person at the ice cream shop and be like, hey, would you like to go out on a date with me? And it had to end, with an A-frame hug, right? So there's no kissing, no anything. It's kind of really interesting assignment. But why? Because the social script that used to exist around dating has largely been forgotten, right? And replaced with hookup culture. Okay, so what is this, and again, the silence, if we go back to the silence and the boomers, right? Gen X, a little bit less with millennials, because millennials are on the leading edge of hookup culture. There were these very straightforward social scripts. What relationship progressed, what it looked like to ask someone out, how many dates it was before you would go steady, and so on and so forth, how relationships progressed. And largely that's been forgotten for lots of cultural reasons, right? We live in a different world than the silence. And there's no use longing for what was in some case. Okay, so what ends up happening then is hookups end up being this hopeful pathway for those people who want relationships into relationships, right? Maybe, if you hook up and that person really likes you, they might want to go out with you. But it's a kind of convoluted pathway, right? It's not a simple, straightforward sort of thing, right? So you hook up with them, okay, so that one okay, right? And maybe you exchange numbers, and then, you could have multiple recurrent hookups, which is what Freitas refers to it as. You might call them booty calls. I love this class sometimes. I get to say fun things. You become friends with benefits, or whatever the kids are calling it now, right? So that maybe, if you're lucky or unlucky, depending, one of the two people or both of them catch feelings, and you start dating, and you go on, and everything, everything goes well, and you end up dating for a long time, living together, getting married, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but the problem is, because the social script, right, or the social contract emphasizes things like it's supposed to be brief, no communication, right? Zero emotions, right? Because it's supposed to be quick, it's supposed to be efficient. Emotions aren't efficient, right? Your vacuum cleaner doesn't have emotions because it might feel bad about sucking up those crumbs, right? That's not efficient. So the hookup shouldn't have emotions either, because that gets in the way. Okay, so a lot of that pain, all right, a lot of, this are 41% of unhappies with hookup culture is that they're looking for something else, right? They have this, everybody wants someone to love them, or so I've heard. And they want relationships, but hookups is all they have, and they don't know how to get there, right? Because there isn't an established and kind of universal social script for getting from, crush to, relationship as much. And, I guess I kind of cut this off. I always mean to recrop it. It says, I'm catching feelings. This needs to stop as quickly as my diet did when I saw cheese fries. Okay. Cheese fries have never sounded that appealing to me, though. Okay. So, clean that up. All right. So, how am I doing for time? Oh, so very well. So, dating. What Freitas suggests about dating is that, and like I was just saying on the last slide, people don't know how to date, right? And, I know it sounds really stupid, because how hard is it to date? But they don't know how to enter relationships, right? They don't know how to ask someone out. There isn't as established a script for how to do this. And this has gotten more complicated, not less, by things like online dating, which has muddied the waters even more, right? So it's gotten really, really complicated in this sense, according to Freitas. So they don't know how to date, or they are afraid of dating, so they don't. They either don't do anything, right? That increasing proportion of sort of adults that haven't been with anyone in the last year, or they hook up, right? And it's kind of polarized in those two directions. And yeah, lots of them don't like it, but the culture just doesn't give you another obvious path. Now, I have this infographic. It's fun. Don't take it as gospel, because it's a pretty small sample size, right? 620. Well, I mean, it's probably representative-ish of students at Duke University. Now, it's entirely possible, given that it's Duke, that every person who took this is a sociopath. If you've ever been to Duke, Duke is a really weird place. Really cool campus. It was designed basically to be a knockoff of Princeton. Like, literally, the two campuses look almost exactly the same, because it was like, well, North Carolina needs its own Princeton, so let's just copy Princeton. So it looks just like Princeton. But it's also a very rich school, right? Next to a bunch of schools that aren't nearly as rich, so it kind of has a complex about it. when I was at Duke, I've been to Duke a couple times for conferences. It's a fabulous campus. It's unbelievably beautiful, but the people there suck. And I went to a basketball game because, you know, the Duke Blue Devils are like a big deal in college basketball. I know nothing about basketball, but I was like, oh, I'll go see a game. And they were playing North Carolina State University, and the whole time the Duke fans are screaming, if you can't go to college, that's okay. I guess you can still go to state, right? So, you know, they're being dicks. So they may all be sociopaths. I don't know. But in 2014, you know, 622 of them took this survey, and what you see, right, about 3/4 of them want to be in a romantic relationship, but less than half are. About 3/4 of them hook up 1 or fewer times a month. So there's going to be a lot of those that are, you know, the fewer is 0, right? So fewer is basically 0. They don't hook up at all. So there's a lot of people that aren't particularly active. But this is the one that I find interesting, right? This little box. Who would feel comfortable asking someone out? It's 1/4 of women and less than half of men, right? Which again, this is just an infographic from Duke for a very small scale study. You shouldn't take it as gospel, but it suggests what Freitas is talking about, right? That there is this slight problem where people don't know how to do this, right? They're afraid. They don't feel comfortable asking someone out, so they don't. Okay. Still no questions. Perfect. This is straightforward. All right, and again, I'm going to write this word again, because it's one you might not encounter super often in your life, and sometimes, you know, I see it written on the exam as, and that's not right. So I write it for you again. Chaste, right? So what are the romantic ideals that these late millennials, early Gen Zers were sort of espousing? And these are at the 4 college types. Now, I will say at the evangelical colleges, this takes a really weird turn. If you want to find out about that, you got to take a different class with me, CHRTC 309, where I spend a good long time talking about the weird romantic habits of evangelicals at evangelical colleges. And there's a lot of, you know, for girls, you're expected to have be engaged by the end of your senior year. And there's a lot of boys that are really not into that and are, you know, basically just trying to escape their senior year in evangelical college without, you know, somehow getting roped into getting engaged. A lot of girls too that aren't into that either. So there's a lot of like, I am not dating anyone. I am here to learn. But anyway, the evangelicals are their own special category of people. But at all 4 types of colleges, right? What was the romantic, what's the idea of romance, right? So people are like, what do I want out of romance, right? So it is not, you know, frantically making out in the corner after you've had, you know, a couple of beers or a lot of beer or, you know, half a Mickey of tequila. It is things like long walks, coffee shops, picnics, right? It's a lot of talking and getting to know the other person. So what this suggests is what people want out of it, right, is connection. And Freitas said that is really deep connection with other human beings, right? They want relationships, they want to be known, they want to know about people, and very little of it involved sex, at least initially, right? Romance could lead to sex, but, you know, it wasn't like, you know, sex on the first date or even sex on the 3rd date was necessarily what people were looking for in terms of romance. It was way far in the future, maybe someday. And I mean, one of the things we know from a lot of the social science data is, especially for women, most women would like to, if you ask them in kind of social science research, push the first time they have sex with a new partner off way further than they actually, you know, than what they actually do, right? They're talking months, and often it's like 3-4 dates into a relationship. So, you know, they'd like to push it off further, but there's a lot of pressure to go the other way. Okay, some, you know, still say that it involves kissing, but in the sense of a goodnight kiss, you know, at the end of a great date where you walked on the beach or sat under the stars, or went for a great dinner, or, spent hours chatting in a coffee shop, whatever it happened to be. Virtually no one included alcohol or drugs in their idea of romance. There was some like a glass of wine with dinner, but no getting drunk, certainly. And certainly no substance use, right? No weed or anything like that. Okay. All right, how am I doing for time? I'm doing so good today. This is much easier material. So, we talked a little bit about a sex recession, right? And again, I'm going to show you a little bit of data here that suggests that's the direction of movement. Now this data, and I've tried to update it for a few years, but the CDC has not been forthcoming with better results than this, presented in a way that I could easily access without actually downloading the database and doing the work in either SPSS or R, which I just haven't had time to do. But if we take kind of a look at the direction of travel for a lot of these trends, right? We see things like, ever had sexual intercourse, right? So this is from the National Youth Risk Behavior Study. So this looks at young people, between 13 and 18 years old. And so it's a good kind of measure, and especially because we get to go back in this database to about 1991, it gives us a good measure of how things have changed in the intervening, don't tell me that 1991 was 30 years ago. 30 years, right? So, or more than 30 years. Oh, I feel old now. I was in grade 3 in 1991. Okay, forward we go. So, ever had sexual intercourse? And what we see, if we go back to those heady days of 1991, over half of young people 13 to 18 had sex at some point. By 2015, that number was down to 41.2. Now again, this is really interesting because this is pre-COVID data, right? COVID will have made a bunch of this stuff much muddier and probably quite a bit worse, because there's going to be that period, from 2020 to like 2023, where this will have declined even more for obvious reasons. Okay, this one had sexual intercourse before age 13. Apparently back in 1991, this was 10% of the population. Hopefully that's some social desirability bias stepping in, because that's a distressing amount, but whatever. But, and here I'm going to say I'm not sad about this one, now it's down to 3.9%, right, by 2015. So a pretty steady decrease overall. And a decrease from 91 to 2015 and from 2013 to 2015. Had sexual intercourse with 4 or more partners. Again, it was almost 20% back in 1991. Man, Gen X got to it. I mean, that's kind of consistent with what Twangy told us at the beginning of the course, right? Short childhood, long adolescence for Gen X. By the time we, start to see Gen Z here, down to 11.5%. So a pretty significant drop. Again, decreases across the board over time. We're currently sexually active. This one, doesn't really drop substantially. It stays pretty close, I would say, within margin of error, right until 2015. So that very well may be like, just a weird sampling, or it could be that you kind of hit Gen Z and then things really dip off, right? So that's possible. It decreased, but not much. But I think that, that last one from 2013 to 2015 is really interesting because it's a big dip. And then, condom use, this was the one that's most differentiated, right? So increase from 1991 to 2015 overall, right? It was pretty low. But then they differentiated here, right? 1991 to 2003, 1991 to 2003, right? We saw an increase, but after 2003, it starts to drop again. And what I'll say, and if you want to know my opinion, and hopefully you do because you're here in a class taught by me, I think what you're seeing here, especially when we get to this point, right, from 2003-ish, and especially the further forward you go here, we'll call this the hub era, if you know what I mean, right? So this is the hub era. This is roughly the period where you get the big internet porn sites, sometimes called the hub sites or the tube sites, because they are porn sites that either end in hub or tube. And they start to, kind of, I don't want to say pollute the information environment, but whatever, I just did. The availability of internet pornography really, really jumps after this point. Internet connections get much faster. And then right around here, you get the iPhone. And then, by the time you're kind of moving forward in this timeline, more and more people have smartphones, and more teenagers are carrying, devices in their pocket that allow them to access these tube sites relatively easily. And one of the things that's generally true with the porn industry, especially the one that's based in California, is that they tend to want their performers not to use condoms. And so in all sorts of kind of studies, what we've seen is the more porn people consume, the less likely they are to use a condom, because what's been modeled for them in what they're looking at in terms of their sexual kind of scripts doesn't prize condom use and often doesn't use condoms. So I think that's what's happening here. And why you see it go up from here to here, right? Because there were these information campaigns and school programs being like, use a condom. And then, it drops off as porn really kind of takes over the space in the hub era. I believe that is a term that I have dubbed. What age group is that's 13 to 18. That's our age group. Okay. What an interesting transition I have. It's like I planned it. I'm going to tell you a very short and very funny story. So I've been teaching on this for a long time, right? I added this on, it must have been like 7 years ago into this course, talking about pornography, because I think it's a really interesting topic. And those of you who know me a little better knows that I did one of, my master supervisor at University of Calgary, her name is Rebecca Sullivan, one of the leading porn scholars in Canada. So while I've never done research on porn directly, I've been in the, orbit of the porn studies community. So I've always found it a kind of interesting topic. And one year we were in Torrey basement, and I walked into the room that day and the class was unusually full, because again, it was an afternoon class. And so I pull up my slides and I pull up this slide, and half the people look really, really confused. And then they start to shuffle out and leave. I think they had gotten the room confused with another room they had booked on campus. And then randomly through the lecture, people would walk in, do this, and then slowly back out of the room, I'm clearly in the wrong place. So I always this. I know this slide doesn't look like much, but it has a close place in my heart. Okay, so porn. All right, so pornography. And then, again, this is an infographic, so don't take it as the a rule of life. But porn obviously is everywhere, and a lot of people consume pornography, right? It is 30% roughly, and this is true, of all internet traffic is dedicated to porn. 40 million regular visitors to porn sites in the US. So, if the entire population of Canada was just like, hey, let's watch some porn, that's basically what's happening at any given moment. And about two-thirds of men admit watching porn, and about a third of women do as well. Now, the bulk of them are young, right? About 70% are men 18 to 24. The average age at which a young boy is first exposed to pornography today, anyone want to take a guess? All right, I'll just say it. It's 8 years old, right? And again, what's the villain or the culprit? It's the smartphone, right? And it's the fact that, especially if they're in school and they're taking the bus or they're on the playground, right? Other kids have smartphones with unlimited data plans and unlimited internet access. They're older kids maybe are looking at porn and, they show it to younger kids, however it happens, right? But the average age at which people are first exposed is 8 years old, okay? And you start to see compulsive use of pornography in some cases as young as 11 to 13, right? Where young boys have been exposed to it and are using it compulsively. So, and again, devices given to them by parents, that are taken to bedrooms, and, the rest is history, if you will. Okay. Now, I will say, this is an infographic. I can't remember from where I took this one. I used to have one from Covenant Eyes, and I always felt it was a little self-serving because it's a company that makes software to block porn. So, they get to jack up the stats a little bit. But 90% of children 8 to 16 have viewed porn. The largest consumers are 12 to 17-year-old boys, right? Going through puberty, lots of urges, blah, blah, blah. 70% of men 18 to 34 visit a porn site typically in a typical month. 1 in 6 women struggle with porn addiction. Now, I'm not always 100% on board with the pathologization of porn use, right? And the addiction language that goes with it. I do think increasingly with the tube sites, they're structured in a way to make them potentially addictive, right? Because they have a lot of the same things you would see in social media that makes social media really hard to quit. But they've been talking about porn addiction forever, and so I'm always a little uncomfortable with this language because, addictions have their own specific pathways and pathologies. About a quarter of search engine requests are for porn, right? So I don't know if you've ever seen those Google in real life videos, right? Where if Google was a person and people come asking him for inappropriate things, that's what it looks like. Okay, and maybe I'll end with this. I'll tell you some of the problems of porn research, because sometimes you'll see in the media, some big study about pornography that came out with these dramatic results. Either it's the best thing in the world or it's the worst thing in the world. Okay, there's a lot of problems with sociological and psychological research about pornography. So one of the big ones is social desirability bias. People don't really want to talk about their porn use for obvious reasons, so they lie, right? They will probably, those numbers that I showed you, those infographics, are probably on the low end because, except for the ones that are gathered from Google and tech sites where you can run algorithms, because people don't want to talk about how much they use pornography. People who have tried to do randomized control trials, RCTs are the best way to do any kind of population research, but you need a control group. And very famously, a few years ago at MIT, they tried to do a study on pornography use, and they tried to collect a control group of young men at MIT who didn't use pornography, and they were unable to form a large enough control group. So they abandoned the study. All right, and our lab studies that do brain scans have a whole bunch of methodological problems, including really small sample sizes, as small sometimes as 3 people, right? Where people are we did brain scans on people watching porn and this is what we found. No, they did brain scans on 3 people who were watching porn because those are the only people that agreed to be put in a functional MRI machine while they watched porn. Weird, right? Because it doesn't sound fun. So they have a lot of methodological problems. So a lot of the research, to be honest, is kind of garbage. I'm going to give you next time some of the research that isn't garbage. There is some really good research on it, and we'll talk about that on Wednesday. And we'll try to finish up this unit so that Friday we are all set to go for some fun review, question asking, happy time. Okay. Oh yeah, no worries.
I can use WhatsApp to compare
perception, even though it's probably far less than you think.